This is Daniel Simon at Baton Rouge Community College. This is my weekly podcast on World War One, Week 4. This is Part 2, continuing with World War One. Now, from this week, of course, we left off in Part 1 at the end of it on, I think we were talking about the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of Somme, which were some of those stalemate battles that happened in 1916. And then I think we talked about a few other things, but before that. But I'm going to move on to talk about what happened in the Eastern Front, which was totally different from the West. Western Front was a stalemate, neither side winning. But the Eastern Front was a Central Powers victory. The Germans, of course, were the main, armies that pushed the Russian forces back in the east through Poland and the Ukraine, and up to like 1914, 1916, which I'll mostly talk about. The war effort was mostly led by like a cousin of Emperor Nicholas II, which was Grand Duke Nicholas. He was the head of the Russian armies, which the Russians in the east had sizable armies. They had about 6 armies with 200,000 men each, so about 1.2 million troops. In the beginning of the war in 1914, August 1914, the Russian forces tried to invade into the German Empire, and it led to a series of battles. And on the Eastern Front, they had 2 really good German generals, which were General Paul von Hindenburg and then also another general named Erich Ludendorff. Their forces just, if you know much about it, would beat the Russians badly. They had 2 important battles in 1914, August and September. They had the first battle was the Battle of Tannenberg, which happened mostly kind of in western Poland, roughly. It happened August 26th to the 31st, 1914. Anyway, German force under what is mostly Ludendorff and Hindenburg just smashed the Russians in that battle. And the Russians suffered awful casualties, like something like 150,000. The Germans only like 15,000. It was totally lopsided battles. And then another battle in September called the Battle of Masurian Lakes, September 7th to the 14th. Again, that was fought in East Prussia, that one. That battle was also another rout as well. And I think the casualties were like 100,000 Russian casualties. Germans only had 10,000. So both those were big blows for the Russian army on the Eastern Front. So the Russians thought they were just going to march into the German Empire, invade it. Their forces got routed in both those battles. You'll see in the next year or two, the Russian forces suffer a lot of casualties in the war, like something like 2-3 million killed and wounded in the war. So they don't do well. Then in 1915, the Germans counterattacked in a major offensive, although it seemed minor at the time, called the Garlice-Tarnow offensive, which happened in May, June 1915. It was actually a battle, or really offensive, to counterattack the Russians, the Russians fared better on the Eastern Front against Austria-Hungary. And it was like this counterattack to aid Austria-Hungary. And what happened was the Garlice-Tarnow offensive, it's called, would actually create a huge opening in the Eastern Front, where the Russian forces at that point were forced to retreat. It was called what the Russians call it, the Great Retreat. That's what the Russians called it. They retreated from like Poland into the Ukraine. And so between 1915 to 1916, the Germans, their allies, start pushing the Russians back into what is the Ukraine. So it got so bad that Nicholas II decided he had to do something, and so he took over the Russian armies, actually commanded them in the field. This happened in the fall of 1915. That's when things started to look bad for the Russians, which will lead to the Russian Revolution. And so Nicholas II went to the front lines, and he left his wife in control of the government. Her name is Empress Alexandra, Here's a picture, by the way, of the royal family in Russia, the Romanov family. You've got Nicholas II in the middle with his wife with the crown on her head on the top, Empress Alexandra. She's actually German, Alexandra. That's all their children, which is he's got like four. I think he's got what three daughters? No, four daughters actually. A lot of daughters. Four daughters, and of course their son, the Tsarevich. And anyway, they had this other guy named Rasputin. And Rasputin was their spiritual advisor, and over time he became their main advisor that helped run the government as Nicholas was at the front lines. And Rasputin was a mysterious figure. He wasn't really he wasn't a member of the Orthodox Church. He was some kind of religious mystic that had some kind of miracle powers or miraculous powers, because apparently he had somehow healed their son, the Tsarevich, who had hemophilia. And so he became real popular. They called him all kinds of names. I think it was called the Mad Monk or something like that. And so he and Empress Alexandra ran the government in St. Petersburg, which during the war, St. Petersburg was called Petrograd, basically. So that's all going on at that point, 1915 to 1916. And eventually some of the nobility got sick of Rasputin, if you know about it. And they had him murdered. December 1916, they actually killed Rasputin. You know the story about Rasputin. They had a hard time trying to kill him. Tried to poison him, and apparently didn't kill him for some reason. So I think they shot him and beat him up, and that still didn't kill him. They finally just threw him in the Neva River, where I don't know if he even drowned. I think they found water in his lungs, so eventually died of his wounds, I guess. But the nobility thought if they maybe killed him, that would maybe get more power back into the nobility and the Romanov dynasty rather than him. And they think that the killing of Rasputin they think still led to the Russian Revolution anyway. So eventually, as the Tsar is at the front, there's a growing movement by socialists in the country to overthrow, the regime of the Romanov dynasty. And so it happens in February of 1917, as you know, the Russian Revolution breaks out. The Russian Revolution 1917, of course, would heavily influence what happens to Russia during the war and after the war. Russia, of course, would drop out of the war, would eventually sue for peace with the Germans separately, so-called Brest-Litovsk Treaty, they call it. And anyway, when the Tsar's at the front, basically in Petrograd, the people revolt against the regime, and the regime is overthrown. They call it the February Revolution. Some people call it the March Revolution, too. The February Revolution overthrows the Tsar, and basically the Tsar is forced to abdicate his throne. So Nicholas II is the last Tsar of Russia at that point. And anyway, what the Russians do is they put in a temporary government, call it different names, but somebody call it the Russian Provisional Government, which was in power for several months afterwards. And I guess Russia's kind of like almost like a Republican type government with a prime minister as the head. It's mostly a parliamentarian government that's run by what they call the Duma. The Duma was what they call the Russian Parliament, which had been founded back in 1905, after the Russian Revolution of 1905. And I think over time, the guy that eventually is the head of it, if you know about it, is, I think about the summer, is Alexander Kerensky, who was actually a socialist, more of a moderate one. He ran the government. And but when that's going on, one of the things that happened, of course, in Russia was in exile, of course, if you know about it, was the social democrat and communist, which is, of course, Vladimir Lenin. You see there, Lenin, I think, was in Germany. He had been in exile for years. I think the Tsar had exiled him and his family. He lived in a bunch of countries, and Lenin was allowed to return to Russia. There's a story where the Germans put him in a sealed boxcar and said, "Hey, don't let him out until he gets back to Russia, which some people think there may have been a plot there by the by the Germans to maybe get the Russians to knock themselves out of the war by sending Lenin there. And of course, Lenin gets there. Lenin is the head of what they call the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were social democrats that were radical socialists that were in Russia. And of course, they're later given another name, which is the so-called Russian communists, as they're called. The word Bolshevik meant majority, because it was considered the majority faction, I guess, of social democrats that were in Russia. Lenin's got a lot of people that were with him later. We'll talk about, like Leon Trotsky was involved. He was a social democrat, communist. Of course, Stalin was real famous, as you know. He later takes over after Lenin dies. So all these were basically involved with the Bolsheviks as a whole. And anyway, eventually, with the war going bad, the Russians are losing. They're getting pushed back, through the Ukraine. What eventually happened, Lenin basically forms a coup against the Kerensky government. That happens in October of 1917. That leads to what they call the October Revolution, which is what the communists of Russia will call it later. So-called October Revolution. And basically they would seize control of all the main government buildings in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and including the so-called Winter Palace, which is where Kerensky had his main headquarters. And Kerensky was forced to flee the government, flee Russia. Eventually, he ends up in the United States later, I think, Kerensky. He flees the country and all that. And so the Bolsheviks start taking over at that point. And what's going to happen, of course, at the end of 1917 and 1918, so that's going to lead to the Russian Civil War breaking out. Which the Russian Civil War lasted over 4 years until 1922. The Russian Civil War was a bloody civil war that Russia went through, where I think they say maybe 10 million people died in Russia during the war. At that point, Lenin and the Bolsheviks declared a new state, which was actually called the Soviet Russia. And then eventually by 1922, it'll be called the Soviet Union, which is called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also called the CCCP or USSR. And of course, one of the first socialist states to form. A lot of people didn't like it. You had all these anti-communist people that wanted to stop, the spread of this movement in Russia. So the two sides formed up against each other. The two main sides that fought in the Russian Civil War, of course, was the so-called Red side, Red Army, which the Red Army was led by different people. Of course, Lenin was the head of one of the main leaders of the Bolsheviks, but actually the guy that formed the Red Army that fought initially in, of course, the Russian Civil War was Leon Trotsky. He's the guy who founded it originally. Though I think after Trotsky was kicked out, Stalin would take it over. And so the Red Army was one side. Of course, their symbol was the hammer and sickle, red flag. Of course, they have the Soviet Union. The other side was the White Army or White Movement. These were anti-communist forces that were in Russia. They were also pro-Romanov. They wanted to, put the Tsar back on the throne and all that. Which the Tsar was actually imprisoned by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. So they were trying to get him back. So there's different people that led the White Army side. There was actually an admiral in the Russian Navy. Alexander Kolchak was one of the guys that led it. And then Peter Wrangel was another guy that led also the white side in the war. A lot of the countries in Europe, like allies, like France, Britain, U.S., Japan, and others, supported the white side. They were anti-communist, anti-socialist, and so they supported them. But in the end, as you know, the Bolshevik communist side, the red side, won the war. They would take over, pretty much Russia and declare the Soviet Union officially in 1922. So Lenin went on, of course, to be the first ruler of Soviet Russia, Soviet Union. He would be the leader of the state until 1924. He would die, though. He had a bunch of strokes, apparently, and basically came kind of almost like a vegetable, if you study about it. And of course, the guy on the far left there, which is Joseph Stalin. Stalin would eventually take over the Soviet Union eventually by the late 1920s. He became their main leader. And he, of course, was the longest, reigning leader of the Soviet Union, close to 30 years, Stalin. Stalin was, of course, known as a totalitarian dictator. Pretty much reigned with an iron fist, Joseph Stalin. In fact, the name Stalin meant man of steel. It was more of a nickname. He was actually born in Georgia, which is in southern Russia, and was kind of a bandit in his early years. I know, actually robbed banks for the Bolsheviks to get money for him. And he actually did lead some of the Red Army in the war and after. And by the time Lenin was dying, Stalin was kind of taken over. And within a few years, by the late 20s, he pretty much took over the state as their main leader. Now, Stalin is kind of known for a lot of different things with the Soviet Union. Of course, if you know about it, starting like around 1928, 29, Stalin would start this collectivization movement and also try to industrialize the Soviet Union. It was done on a mass scale. And they went to collectivization because they thought that would be the best way to feed all the workers to industrialize the country. So what Stalin did was he forced all the people that were like farming and all that to collectivize, to work with the state, and also basically sell all their produce to the state. Well, the state would basically come and take it from them, is what they really did. And it led to a lot of the peasants didn't want to do it, especially the more well-to-do ones. Like the Soviets called the more well-to-do peasants, they called them kulaks, Kulaks. Kulaks were peasants that owned like more land and hired people, employees, and a lot of them were rounded up, and if they weren't shot, they were sent to like camps in Siberia. And in the Ukraine, it led to mass starvation by the like late 20s, early 30s, where several million people died because like the Soviet forces came in and just took all their food. And the Ukrainians now call it the Holodomor. Oh yeah, Holodomor. And they're not sure how many people died, but several, at least 3 to 5 million, I think, died overall. So the collectivization thing was actually kind of a failure. If you read about what happened with that, but yeah, they did really industrialize the country. It's something they did do, so they were somewhat successful with as a whole. So he made, Stalin did make, the Soviet Union like a world power, especially by World War II and during the early Cold War later. Of course, the most famous thing that Stalin, or infamous thing that Stalin did, was in the 30s, especially late 30s, 1936, 38, I think it was. Soviet Union went through the so-called Great Purge, where Stalin started this period of political repression, where they rounded up anybody that he thought was against the Soviet system, including old Bolsheviks. A lot of old Bolsheviks were rounded up and put on trial, like so-called show trials they were called. And a lot of them were actually sent to either camps, or a lot of them were shot. Stalin had him killed. Leon Trotsky, who was one of the old Bolsheviks, he was actually exiled. They kicked him out of the Soviet Union, and later Stalin sent some secret agents to actually kill him in Mexico, which they did. So a lot of the old Bolsheviks were actually killed by Stalin. Very few of them actually survived from the old days. They're not sure how many people were actually killed in the Great Purge, but maybe over 1 million people were shot or killed by Stalin. And then the rest were then sent to these the Soviet Russian work camps that were all over the Soviet Union that were called the Gulag system. The Gulag system was this system of where they sent like anybody that was a political prisoner, criminals were sent to them, and they used people as slave labor. Millions were sent there. They don't even know how many people were sent there. I've seen where 15, 20 to maybe more than that were sent to these camps all over the Soviet Union, so-called Gulag system. And they don't know how many people died. So it was like a couple million to several million may have died in the camps. But the Soviets used them to try and industrialize the country. They built canals and so on throughout the country. And I think the most notorious Gulag camp was the one that was up in eastern Siberia that was called Kolyma, with a K. I think it's Kolyma, Kolyma. It's like mostly a Gulag camp they used for like gold mining. It's up in the Arctic Circle. Like I think the temperatures up there were like minus 30, 40 degree temperatures sometimes in the winter. And so a lot of these camps, people were sent there and they were never seen again. And like a lot of people were sent to the camps for just no reason at all. There's actually stories circulated where just like making common jokes about Stalin or something could get you 10, 15 years or something like that. Or just steal some potatoes and they'll give you like 10 years. Anyway, so it was a vast labor camp system, pretty much what it was. And it's very similar to what the Germans had in, like the concentration camps that they had, like in World War II. It's been compared a lot with that. So Stalin is really a totalitarian dictator, but one thing about Stalin, he gets kind of rehabilitated because of World War II. They end up fighting Hitler, and Hitler's seen as a worse guy than Stalin, and so it's not seen as being as bad as a guy compared to Hitler. But Stalin, they think, killed millions of people. Killed a lot of his own people, which they don't know how many people he killed. At least 10, 20 million maybe he may have killed at the most. So, all right. So we'll come back later and talk more about the Soviet Union in the East. But, of course, we're going to go and, of course, turn toward talking about what happens with the United States. Now, the United States enters World War I in 1917. Of course, the reason why the United States got in the war was because of incidents that the Germans were doing predominantly that dealt with the Atlantic Ocean. We would enter the war in April of 1917, and there was, of course, one of the big things that really got us in the war was the German unrestricted submarine warfare. That was kind of a problem. And of course, there was an incident that happened in May of 1915, which was the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, which was a British passenger liner that was bound from New York City to Liverpool in England. And it was sunk in the Irish Sea by a German U-boat, submarine. I think the date was May 7th, 1915. And about 139 Americans were killed on board. The ship went down in 18 minutes after it was torpedoed. About 1,198 people were killed. And so it was a very interesting incident in the war that they think propelled the United States into supporting the Allied side against the Germans. We didn't declare war at that time, but it obviously created a lot of tensions between the United States and Germany. And so later it'll influence us to declare war on Germany. And at that point, we were starting to supply the Allies. Some people believe we did have armaments on board, which it may have. And I think they found a manifest years later and found basically that. But we'll continue, of course, to support the Allies, even though we're neutral when President Woodrow Wilson is the President of the United States at the time. So that was definitely one incident that really caused us to get in the war later. Then there was another incident, of course. What did the Germans do at that point? Well, there was another incident that happened in, I think it was in March of 1916. There was another passenger ferry ship called the Sussex that was sunk. And we were threatening to declare war on the Germans in 1916. And the Germans decided they had to do something, so they intervened and they made this pledge, or I think it was called the Sussex Pledge or Sussex Ultimatum. And it was basically a deal where the Germans agreed to warn passenger ships before sinking them. So they did this to try to prevent us from getting in the war. They did this for several months until, I think, January of 1917. And the Germans eventually went back to unrestricted submarine warfare, and that's one of the key things that got us in the war later. Then there was, of course, another incident that happened, I think, around January, February of 1917. That was the famous Zimmerman telegram or Zimmerman note. And I think it was in January 19th, I think is the date, they believe. The foreign minister of Germany, his name was Arthur Zimmerman, sent a telegram to Mexico, to like their ambassadors, German ambassadors that were in Mexico. And what they wanted is they wanted to get the Mexicans to try to form an alliance with Germany against the United States. And in the telegram, they said that what they would do is they would send military aid to the Mexicans if they would attack the United States. The Germans were what they would plan to do is they would try to help the Mexicans get back territory that the United States had conquered from them. I think they promised they would try to get Mexico back, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, which we had taken from them years ago, back during the Mexican-American War, back in the 1800s. And I think they also promised they were trying to get Japan, believe it or not, in the telegram. They wanted Japan to join the Central Powers too, with Mexico against us. And this really angered the United States because the United States was already having problems with Mexico already, because Mexico was going through kind of like a civil war, which had broken out in 1910. And we had actually sent forces down into Mexico because I think Pancho Villa, who was a Mexican bandit, had actually attacked New Mexico and killed some Americans. And we'll get to it later, but there was a general named John Pershing, who was involved in this thing called the Mexican Punitive Expedition. He went down into Mexico after Pancho Villa, tried to arrest him, and but he got away, Pancho Villa. And we'll talk about Pershing a little bit, but Pershing's eventually going to be the main commander of the American forces in France. So that really angered the United States. At that point. And so we declared war on the Germans on April 6th, 1915. And so we got in World War I. And so that's considered a big turning point in the war when the United States entered to fight the Germans. Now, we didn't have much of an army when the United States entered the war. In fact, our military was pretty pathetic. 1917 when we entered the war. And so we had to raise an army, and so they began drafting troops all over the country. The U.S. Congress passed an act which was called the Selective Service Act of 1917, which was basically a wartime draft to draft American men to fight the Germans in France in the war. And it ended up forced like 24 million men to register for the draft in the United States. It's a lot. So 24 million men registered for the draft. I think they would eventually draft about 4 million men. I would say about 2 million men eventually were sent over to fight. Maybe not that many. It was close to 2 million men I know that went over to fight, the Germans in France and all that. And the army they formed was originally called the American Expeditionary Force, or the AEF, it was dubbed. The guy they put in command of it, of course, I just mentioned a little while ago, was, of course, Black Jack Pershing, or John Pershing, his name. Of course, one of the most decorated American soldiers in American history, probably up to that point. Pershing had fought all over the place. He had fought in the Spanish-American War. Actually went up there with Teddy Roosevelt, you know, about this storm San Juan Hill and all that, the Rough Riders. He also fought in the Philippines. He tried to take over the Philippines as well. And he was called Blackjack Pershing because one of his first commands, by the way, if you know about this, was commanding African American troops during the Spanish American War, which were often called Buffalo Soldiers. So that's why he got the name Blackjack. So anyway, so he was like one of the greatest soldiers, you know, at that time. And like I told you, he even went to Mexico, tried to go after Pancho Villa, Mexican punitive expedition, but failed on that. So they put him in command of the American forces. And over time, the U.S. will form an army in France, which will be the first U.S. Army, which we'll get to later. So basically, yeah. Now, there were some troops that did reach France first. There was a guy named Douglas MacArthur. You may have heard of him. He fought in World War II. He was only a colonel at the time. He led a force which was called the U.S. Army 42nd Division. That was actually the first American force to reach France and fight there. I think they reached there in November 1917. They were known as the Rainbow Division. They were called this because they were mostly composed of National Guardsmen from all over the country. I think from 26 states were involved. They were called the Rainbow Division because they wore a patch on their shoulder, which was a rainbow of, I guess, of all the different states they were from. They were actually the first to fight, but pretty much between 1917 and 1918, most of the American forces fought alongside the French, like a Franco-American force. And we don't really have our own separate army fighting in France until really around September 1918. So it's a while that we're really actually doing anything over there at that point. So that's really a turning point. The United States getting involved, you know, brought in fresh troops. We were supplying the Allies in the war. And so it played kind of a vital role in why the Allies would eventually win the war in 1918. Now, the Germans, though, they were kind of worried about the United States entering the war. So they had formed a treaty with the Soviet Russia, which, of course, was called the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. I think was signed in March of 1918. So Russia dropped out of the war. In fact, the Germans had basically taken over, like, I think, Poland and the Ukraine. They seized, like, I think the Crimea, believe it or not, and also Finland. Finland was taken over, which will become a separate state after the war. All that had basically been taken by the Germans in the Eastern Front. Well, yeah, and so with the Russians knocked out of the war, what happened was the Germans decided to do a big offensive in the West in March 1918. It became known as Operation Michael. It was led by General Paul von Hindenburg. And so the Germans launched a huge attack on the West to try to break through. The offensive will last about around 2 months, roughly. And at one point, the Germans pushed the Allies back in some points 60 miles. Yeah, they almost broke through 1918. A lot of the German forces formed like salients or little bulges in their like Allied lines. And the Germans used these special forces that were armed with like a new weapon. They were armed with like submachine guns. I don't know if you know about this, but like at the end of the war, the Germans invented the submachine gun, and they used that in some of the pitched battles. And like the troopers that were involved in it were called stormtroopers, was a term they used, which they later they used in war too, I guess. And they would push them back. And like a lot of these battles the U.S. was involved in, I think our big battle on the Western Front at that point was in September 1918. We fought in the Battle of St. Michel, like September 12th to the 15th, 1918. Battle of St. Michel was an American battle to take back the city of Metz, which had been taken by the Germans, which was actually a success. And of course, Pershing was in charge of the American forces there. And after that battle, we formed the First U.S. Army, which was involved in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which would follow after that. So that led to the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which happened from September to November of 1918. That was really the biggest battle, most important battle, and last battle on the Western Front in World War One, which would be, of course, an Allied victory. And in that battle, a combination of French and American forces, maybe with some British, mostly American and French forces, attacked the Germans on the Hindenburg Line. And the U.S. forces mostly fought in what is the Argonne Forest sector, so-called Battle of the Argonne. So that was our biggest battle in World War One. It's one of our bloodiest battles of all time. 1.2 million American forces fought in the Battle of the Argonne Forest. We suffered something like 122,000 killed and wounded. So it's like one of our bloodiest battles we ever fought in. Like that and the Battle of the Bulge. It's pretty bloody. And was it World War II? Anyway, we eventually, over like a period of like 2.5 months, eventually pushed the Germans back through the Argonne Forest area. And we pushed them eventually back into Belgium, is what we eventually do. And I guess one story I will talk about, the Argonne battle, which is very famous. Of course, the most decorated soldier of World War One on the American side was this American soldier that fought in the Argonne battle. His name was Sergeant Alvin York. And York was known for single-handedly taking out a detachment of German forces. Yeah, by himself, which is amazing. Actually killed 35 Germans single-handedly, captured 122 prisoners, like by himself. And anyway, captured him and did all this. He became like a big hero. He was awarded by the U.S. Congressional Medal of Honor. The French honored him with a medal. And he became a big hero after the war. And they even made movies about him. I think Gary Cooper starred in a movie called Sergeant York about Alvin York, his career. And so he's a very famous figure in the Argonne battle. So by the end of October 1918, the Germans, their army starts collapsing. There's a revolution, I'll get to talk about that starts breaking out in Germany, the so-called German Revolution, where the people kind of revolt against the war. The German forces suffered badly. They were not just running out of troops. They were actually bringing up kids, practically, to fight in the war. A lot of the veterans had been killed. And then also the influenza epidemic, they say, played kind of a toll on the German forces. Also on the Allied, too, which we'll get to later. But that had also played a toll, too, as well. And so eventually the Germans started to talk about, trying to surrender at that point. And so on November 11th, 1918, the Germans met with the Allied forces at a place called the Forest Compiègne in France. And they decided that they would sign an armistice to end the war. They all met in this rail car in the Forest Compiègne. They agreed to a ceasefire at 11 a.m. To basically end the war. So they say on the 11th day of the 11th month of the 11th hour, the war eventually came to an end. So that was the war to end all wars at that point. However, the war wasn't officially over. That just was an armistice to basically like a ceasefire at that point. And so basically after the war, 1919, as you know, the Allies would then meet in Paris, France, to decide the fate of what happened after the war with the Germans, which led to the Treaty of Versailles, in 1919, which I'll mostly talk about at the end of this lecture. And the Paris Peace Conference met between January to June of 1919. You know much about it. Was supposed to go into the Treaty of Versailles, was supposed to be based on what was called the 14 points. The 14 points was a speech given by Woodrow Wilson in January of 1918. He was, of course, the current president of the United States, the Democratic Party. And Wilson had developed these 14 ideas, which were kind of a peace plan to solve the differences in Europe after the war. It was also supposed to, I think, get the Germans to come to the peace table early, to end World War I early, to stop all the bloodshed, because the war had killed like 10 million people. And so he had 14 ideas that he had in it. A lot of these would get either rejected or compromised at, of course, the peace conference. The peace conference would last, like I said, 6 months, January to June 1919. And at the Paris Peace Conference, there were 4 main powers that dominated it. They were, of course, France, Britain, Italy, and the United States. These, of course, are the 4 main heads of state that were involved in it. The so-called Big Four, they were dubbed. They were the leaders of these countries that were involved. And kind of from, I guess, from left to right, yet on the far left, you had David Lloyd George. He was the prime minister of France. Vittorio Orlando was the prime minister of Italy. You had George Clemenceau was the ruler, of course, of France. And then you had Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States. Clemenceau was sometimes called the Tiger, known for his walrus mustache, you can see. And they call him Victor Clemenceau as well. And Clemenceau didn't really like Wilson. In fact, he thought a lot of the 14 points were a bunch of nonsense. And I think he made a joke about the 14 points where he said, even Almighty God only had 10, as the 10 Commandments. So really, it really should be the big 3, which is, Britain, France, and U.S., because those 3 countries really dominated the whole conference. Italy, I think, was mostly in it because they saw it as an opportunity to seize territory from Austria-Hungary, and that's pretty much why they were there. So they didn't really do much, Italy. It was mostly just Britain, France, and the U.S. They really, put stuff into it. And so the Big Four, and the main allies that were there, pretty much dictated to Germany what would go into the Treaty of Versailles. They really didn't have much choice. It's like, here, sign here. That's pretty much what they told them. And so what came out of the conference that's famous, well, the big thing, if you know what happened with the Germans, was that they made the Germans pay huge amounts of war reparations, war damages to the Allies, which numbered close to about, I think it was like $32 billion would be the amount I think it was. And which they would have to pay over a long time. I think for a while Hitler, I know, didn't want to pay it. But believe it or not, the Germans actually paid it off in 2010. They eventually did pay it all off over time, but it would wreck the German economy after the war, if you know about it, and pretty much led to the rise of Hitler. And I think the Germans had spent like $100 billion on the war. So they owed like 130-something billion after the war. So that's not good. So that's a big thing. Also, the about the Allies, divided up the spoils of the war. They took all the German territory from them, like Africa, all their African colonies. They took their colonies in the Atlantic. They took territory from Germany itself and made it out of different countries, which I'll get to later. Same thing of Austria-Hungary as well. They took their military. They said that the Germans could only have like 100,000-man army. They couldn't have a navy. They couldn't have an air force. So they had to sink all their ships. They had to destroy all their planes after the war. And then there was one thing they did too with the Germans, which was kind of, if you know about it, that's infamous, was they made the Germans sign this part that was called Article 231, also called the War Guilt Clause. The War Guilt Clause was this clause saying that Germany was the reason why the war happened. They were guilty for starting the war. And so psychologically, they put that idea in their head that they had caused the war, not just trying to punish them by, making them pay money or seizing land or whatever. They said, hey, you caused the war, Germany. So a lot of the Germans later were kind of mad about that. They thought the treaty was too harsh. Hitler thought, sought revenge later. And so a lot of people believe the Treaty of Versailles, in a sense, caused World War II later, which they think it did. Now, the treaty itself was signed on June 28th, by the way, 1919, which is, by the way, the 5th-year anniversary of when the Archduke was shot. So it was signed in the Hall of Mirrors and all that. And so that was basically what, ended the war officially. They did form this organization called the League of Nations after the war. It's actually the 14th point, most famous point in Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. The League of Nations was this international peacekeeping organization that was formed after the war to try to solve differences diplomatically between countries. Formed in 1919. And a bunch of countries joined. However, it was ineffective after the war. I think Wilson got the Nobel Peace Prize for the idea. But countries like the United States refused to back it at first. The U.S. even refused to support the ratification of the actual Treaty of Versailles. We wouldn't even support it because the U.S. went into kind of an isolation period between World War I and World War II. We didn't want to get involved in any more things in Europe intervening, so we went in isolation in the 30s and 30s mostly. And anyway, so we'll get to the League of Nations. It's a total failure. Stopping Hitler, Mussolini, all these dictators that rise to power between the wars, and also Japan, also as well. Aftermath of the war. Now, a few more things about the war as well. One thing about the war was the war created a bunch of new countries afterwards. That's one thing it was famous for, which you can see from this map here. Out of the German areas, they formed different countries. Like Poland was formed out of like Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. So yeah, Poland was created as a state, as a whole. Czechoslovakia, you can see, was also formed as well. Austria and Hungary were also formed as well. They actually separated into two states. You can see there. Yugoslavia was a new country that formed. Remember, that was the area that started World War I. There's those Slavic states there that wanted to create a greater Serbia or Yugoslavia. So yeah, they created that state also as well after war. You can see they kind of separate all the Baltic states too, which are their kind of new countries somewhat. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Oh, and Finland. You see up there next to Sweden, between Sweden and the Soviet Union, it would form, like up here, it would form too as a country in 1919 after the war. Romania and Bulgaria were already there. I think the areas of like Romania and Bulgaria kind of changed their states, but they were already countries at that point. You can see Albania is below Yugoslavia. Turkey would, of course, separate because the Ottoman Empire broke up after the war, and they would form the Republic of Turkey in 1923. And parts of the Middle East, like Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, which is Israel, Iraq, all those areas would be occupied by the French and British after the war. Yeah, they would occupy them like between the wars. And those will become separate states, but that won't happen until after World War II in the Middle East. So that's kind of what your post, World War I Europe looks like at that point. The only bad thing about that is all those are weak countries that, will later get conquered by Hitler. Hitler and the, Nazi Germany will eventually come and conquer all that. And so that's something that's bad about that, after the war. So we'll talk about that in another lecture when we get to the rise of fascism in World War II. Now, cost of the war, aftermath of the war, how many people died in the war? About 10 million people died, like soldiers wise. So 10 million soldiers died in the war. About maybe another 10 million civilians died. So maybe close to 20 million people, maybe more, died in the war total overall. French suffered the most on the Allied side. Well, actually, the French and the Russians had a lot of deaths. French had about 1.4 million dead. The Russians 1.7 million dead. British almost a million dead. Americans 120,000 dead. So not that many. The Germans had 1.8 million dead. Austria, Hungary 1.2 million dead. Ottoman Empire 325,000. So that's about the deaths, like the soldier deaths that were in World War One. However, the number one killer in World War One was not battle deaths. It was disease. Of course, the number one killer, if you know about it, was influenza. Of course, at the end of World War One, 1918 or so, 1919, they had the famous influenza pandemic that took place around the world. Some people call it the Spanish flu, if you know about that. And it killed something like 50 to 100 million people throughout the world. I think I think India had the most deaths, with almost 20 million people that died. And the United States had 600 to 700,000 Americans died from influenza. So it's one of our worst pandemics we've ever had in the United States. So hopefully, the coronavirus won't be that bad compared to that killer. But anyway, yeah, it killed lots of people, and more soldiers died from influenza than actual battle deaths. And it may have affected the Germans in the war, and a lot of the Germans lost because it crippled some of their soldiers who couldn't fight in the war as a whole. So that ends this podcast on World War One. Of course, next week, week 5, we'll be getting into the rise of fascism. Of course, get into probably the outbreak of World War II as well. And so, yeah, we're getting more into the later part of the 20th century, which between the wars, it's not as bad compared to World War One, but you'll see the rise of the fascist dictators like Hitler and Mussolini. That leads into, of course, World War II. So that's it for the week.